Good afternoon, good evening to our participants in Asia, and good morning to those in North America. My name is Fabrice Potier. I am Senior Consulting Fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and I have the pleasure today to host the Institute's 4th Defense Innovation Talk, which is kindly supported by Microsoft. Our previous 3 speakers from the UK, France, and the United States had one common theme, and that was China. China as the major strategic competitors to Western powers. And indeed, the People Liberation Army's ambitions, resources, and achievements in the military technological domain make China both a major player in global defense innovation, as well as one of the main reasons and main factors why NATO powers are embarking in the global military technological race. Therefore, it is essential to understand China's defense innovation model, its strengths, but also its gaps, both in its own right, but also to base our decisions on the right assessments. His story is paved with countless examples of bad evaluation or misassessment of the competitor's strengths and weaknesses. And to get China's defense innovation right, we thought we should break with the one-on-one format of the defense innovation talks, and this time bring not 1, not 2, but 3 of the most noted experts on Chinese military affairs. Let me start by introducing them. We have today with us Elsa Kenya, Adjunct Senior Fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Elsa also works in support of the US Air Force China Aerospace Studies Institute and is a non-resident fellow in Indo-Pacific Defense with the Institute for the Study of War and with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. She co-founded the China Cyber and Intelligence Studies Institute, a non-for-profit research collaboration. We also have with us today Dr. Mauro Gili, Senior Researcher in Military Technology and International Security at the Zurich-based Center for Security Studies. Dr. Gili's research covers security studies, military innovations, and the challenges of designing, developing, and employing advanced weapon systems. He's currently working on a book on the success of failure of military technological race, and I hope he will share with us some of his early findings. And we finally have also Maya Nawens, Senior Fellow from Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization at the IISS with us. Maya's expertise lie in Chinese defense industry and innovation, China's regional strategic affairs, and international relations. She leads IISS research on China's digital Silk Road, and prior to joining the IISS, Maya worked at the European External Action Service as a policy officer in Taipei and as a trade analyst in the European Union's delegation to New Zealand. Each of our guest speakers will share today with us some introductory remarks, and we will then turn to a moderated discussion. And as always, please do send your questions with your name and affiliation. As you might know, Zoom does not always indicate those automatically. Without further ado, let me turn to Elsa, who is going to lay out to us the Chinese defense innovation model. Elsa, over to you.
Good morning, and very glad to be joining this timely conversation. And I guess I'll start with the question that is the focus of our session today, whether China is lagging behind in the military technological race. And perhaps another way to frame this would be in the eyes of Chinese military leaders, China has been behind over the past century. And if you look back at to the early days of the People's Republic of China and the challenges facing the PLA as it went from the Red Army in the Chinese Civil War, and a force that was backwards and dependent upon Soviet support and assistance, to a military that was intending to become modern and capable of ensuring China's defense on the world stage. It is staggering how far the PLA has come. Certainly coming back on, looking back on the century of the CCP's history, as in Xi Jinping's recent remarks, I think there are reasons for CCP and PLA leaders to look back at these decades of this drive for military reform with a sense of success. And certainly when there are when we've seen some of the major military parades and the display of new cutting-edge weapon systems, whether that is drones, hypersonics, and an increasingly enthusiasm for some of the intangible capabilities that matter more in modern warfare as well, such as cyber and artificial intelligence. So the PLA has certainly come from a position of being a laggard by all accounts to a military that has quite pragmatically and through all means and resources available been fighting to catch up, and has been quite sensitive to the dangers of technological disadvantage. And I think that is a common feature across the PLA's history that has influenced its sensitivity to and intense preoccupation with questions of how new frontiers in science and technology can start to change the character of conflict. And when I look in particular at the latest phases of China's drive for reform and innovation, I'd actually start with the PLA's response to the US military's success in the Gulf War in the 1990s, at a moment where the PLA had been achieving progress in its modernization and mechanization, but was blown away in a sense by the success of US military power at the time. And this had provoked a lot of concern with the role of information technology in warfare, whether in C4ISR or precision strike and beyond. And that moment, along with some of the other flashpoints in the 90s, the Taiwan Straits crisis, the May 1999 Belgrade embassy bombing, which Chinese leaders at the time believed to be a deliberate attack on their embassy, including because they believed the US military to be so powerful and so capable it couldn't possibly make such a mistake. And I think certainly those moments, including the 995 weapons program launched in direct response to that, really shaped the changes in Chinese military strategy that took shape over the 1990s and really set the PLA on the course it is today. And I think certainly the PLA's efforts across these decades have been relatively consistent in their orientation towards the US military, which is regarded as the powerful adversary, and also as the benchmark by which the PLA has gauged its progress. And certainly these attempts to catch up have often leveraged quite pragmatic mechanisms of the theft and transfer of military technologies along the way, and attempts of reverse engineering and really industrial espionage at scale as a means of trying to close this gap. And I think the question we start to see today as the PLA looks to not only be catching up, but also trying to become a leader, especially in frontiers of technology where the US does not have and may not achieve a clear or decisive advantage. And the question is whether China's model of defense innovation and military modernization can transition from struggling to catch up to fighting to innovate and trying to start to chart the course and be a military that is, as Xi Jinping has directed it to be, world-class and or a global first-tier force that is also on the forefront of a future warfare. And really, since 2014 or so, around the time that the US Defense Department was trying to launch the third offset strategy with the aim to offset and reestablish advantage relative to China, we saw Xi Jinping himself emphasize the importance of disruptive technologies to a new revolution in military affairs and calling for the PLA to pursue innovation on all fronts. And I think this is quite clear in the writings of Chinese military strategists or official statements, whether in remarks by Xi Jinping or defense white papers, that there's a fear of technology surprise, a fear of again being subjected to a generation gap should the US and other Western militaries succeed in some of these and new technologies, but there's also a sense that China is, as a result of its relative success and catching up on many fronts, is now in a stronger position to try to take the lead as we see this transition in the form or character of warfare from informatized to intelligentized, or the idea of intelligent warfare in which artificial intelligence is now critical to military power. And we've seen this focus on emerging technologies really emerge, I would argue, especially since 2016 or 2017 as a core focus for how the Chinese military is thinking about its future power and capabilities, imagining a future battlefield in which these technologies could transform the conduct of operations, whether that is unmanned systems across all domains or AI as an enabler, including of decision advantage. And I think going forward, it is perhaps too soon to say whether the PLA will be successful in really transforming from catching up to trying to leapfrog ahead. But I think we shouldn't overstate or believe that China is already winning the race, such as it is. I think there are reasons to focus, as I know my co-panelists will speak to as well, some of the difficulties and continued weaknesses. But I guess I would close by saying I think we should be skeptical, but take quite seriously the challenge and presented by Chinese military modernization and these initiatives and innovation, given how far the PLA has come and the drive to take advantage of this moment of transition in the conduct of warfare to establish new advantages, potentially seize the strategic commanding heights in a new round of technological competition. So I'll stop there and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Elsa. Before I give the floor to Mauro, just one question. I think you were correct in saying it's too early to say if the PLA has indeed been successful in some of its strategic bets and also some of its investments in innovation. However, what are the few criteria or the few things we should watch to know if at some point indeed they have become successful at not only catching up, like you said, but actually at leading?
Let's see. So I guess I'd say it's too early, not just for the PLA, but arguably for every military, given that some of the technologies that have become, not without reason, a focus of today's rivalries like artificial intelligence are still at quite a nascent stage in their development and encountering a lot of practical limitations to progress. So I think some of the things that I'm watching and looking at the PLA are how much it's moving from having a range of programs and projects for research and development to actually starting to have concrete capabilities with which we're starting to see some experimentation in training and actual implementation. And I think certainly some of the changes to China's system of procurement and greater flexibility in trying to work with the tech sector under the auspices of a national strategy of military civil fusion are really critical components of that agenda, and how well the PLA can break down some of the prior barriers between the military and defense industry relative to the high-tech enterprises that are often driving progress in these fields. I think we're starting to see a lot of partnerships, collaborations, a lot of mechanisms for collaborative innovation. But I think some of the tangible examples we've seen displayed have been drone swarms and claims of AI, for instance, recently being used in training fighter pilots, and a range of applications of AI in military intelligence and information operations as well. And I think some of the initial inklings of experimentation as to where there is there are capabilities coming into play, as well as how we start to see the PLA actually integrating these different components of not just new technology, but also styles of training, approaches to managing talent and cultivating personnel who are capable of handling themselves on a complex battlefield. Yeah, and having theories and doctrine that can actually be finalized and placed into practice. So yeah, I think definitely a lot. We can look at metrics across each particular domain of technology or application, but I think there's sort of still a question of how can the Chinese military, like any bureaucracy, truly reorient itself, change its culture, and change practices that that might otherwise impede innovation from being actualized.
That's I think the fact that we are in an era of permanent operation without necessarily having major operations going on, at least from China's point of view, makes the assessment indeed more complex and in a way has to be more granular with a much broader set of criteria, but nevertheless very important to get right. And for that also, let me now turn to Mauro, who I think will be, from our discussion before our talk today, has very interesting, you have a very interesting kind of perspective on the kind of the weaknesses and strengths of the Chinese model, but also what is up to China and what is up to more external factors. Mauro, over to you.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the very kind innovation. It's very flattering to be both with Maya and Elsa in the same panel. They are two great experts. And let me apologize to the audience. I got my second dose vaccine yesterday, so I'm a bit grounded. If I say something that is not clear, please ask me. I'm very happy to repeat. So apologies if I mumble or something I say is not clear. Yeah, absolutely. So Elsa already touched on many very important points. I would say there are some key strengths and weaknesses in the Chinese model. First of all, that is the most obvious aspect, is how China, because of its political institution, is in the position to really mobilize a lot of resources. That is, in terms of constraints countries generally face when they want to achieve specific goals, China has much more leeway, and these cannot be avoided. This is a big elephant in the room. On top of that, China has been able, whether it was just a set of circumstances or whether identify early on the best strategies, has been really able to put together a lot of overlapping strategies to maximize what it can do and what it can accomplish to try to catch up in different sectors. And in this regard, I think probably it has made treasure of the lesson of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was, to a large degree, a country isolated from the rest of the world, which means that it struggled tremendously to get access to both the know-how, technologies, machine tools that the most kind of advanced sectors of the economy back then required. So a very great book is by Christy McCracky, is an historian at Georgia Tech, and discusses some of these challenges the East Germany faced, but that was the same type of problem. So China has made treasure, and it's really tried to exploit everything it could, including, of course, globalization, open markets, and in particular, foreign direct investment and mergers and acquisition. That is, this clause that China has been imposing on companies that invest in its market, that is called, I think, technology for market. That is, companies that invest in China have to transfer technology. That is, they have to teach local workers, share know-how with local firms in order to have access to the Chinese market. And this has been a really key strategy, in that a lot of aerospace companies, for example, Pratt & Whitney, to mention one, Rolls-Royce, they have invested in China, and of course they have invested in the commercial sector. But we know, for example, in aero engines, on which we'll talk more later, there are some strong overlaps. So this is a key aspect. And of course, together with this strategy to take advantage of market forces, China has also put in place probably the largest campaign of espionage, both traditional espionage, like kind of buying or kind of recruiting spies, infiltrating in different defense organizations. And really, there have been so many. Northrop Grumman, Patterson Wright Air Force Base, where stealth was initially developed, and many others. as well as, of course, cyber espionage. We have all heard about it. So the strength of China is really has been to put all these strategies together. But there are some key weaknesses that depend, as you were mentioning, Fabrice, on the Chinese, on Chinese institution on one end, and then the other also on factors that are just independent of China. When it comes to the domestic factors, we need to consider that modern technologies, and these apply to both commercial technologies. This could be borosilicate pharma glasses, the one we get our vaccine, like the syringes we get our vaccine, are very, very specific technology. Of course, semiconductors, everybody talk about, ballpoint pens, and of course, aerojet engines. So the fan of aero engines is a very, very peculiar technology. So all these technologies nowadays have components that need to meet extremely tight performance metric in terms, for example, of stress, mechanical stresses, thermal fatigue, corrosion resistance. So meeting these tight requirements not only is already extremely difficult per se, because you need first the raw material, second you need the experience on knowing how to accomplish this task, and then you need the specialized machine tools. But the problem is not only developing these components is very, very difficult, it also rely on some sort of very strong trust between the key producer and all the suppliers. Why? Because if a key producer of aero engines, for example, required one of its suppliers that one component need to meet an extremely tight requirement, and if the supplier says, yes, it does, but it doesn't, then the whole engine can break down and the producer will never be able to figure out what is not working, or at least is going to take extensive testing to figure out. And when it comes to China, we know there is a big problem. For example, in the inflation of the GDP data, we know that there are strong incentives in the Chinese domestic system to inflate data. And again, many people question the validity of data on a macroeconomic data. And I don't have data about this, but we cannot exclude that these type of perverse incentives in formally meeting requirements when actually not doing it have played a key role in the struggles China has encountered in some key sectors. And then, of course, together with this, there is the fact that, as I was mentioning, that developing the necessary experience for these cutting-edge technologies just requires time. There is no way around it. You can try to steal as many blueprints. You can try to recruit foreign engineers, but the kind of dispersed knowledge base, that is knowledge distributed among so many different companies on so many different tasks, and that allows such a small margin of error, developing this experience is an extremely long process that you cannot take a very shortcut. I will stop here. So if there is any question now or later, happy to jump back on this.
Actually, I have a follow-up question before I turn to Meya, and is actually borrowing a question from a colleague from the Institute, Ben Barry, who makes an interesting point connected to you laying out both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Chinese defense innovation model. Ben is explaining that by essence, innovation has to be both top-down and bottom-up. And we have actually heard that from previous guest speakers, starting with General Sir Carter, but also from the head of the French Defense Innovation Agency. Yet, as Ben points out in his question, is since China is so top-down with very powerful hierarchies, is that constraining? Do we think this is actually a weakness, or has China managed to overcome that?
Absolutely. It touches upon a key aspect of one point that many agree is a weakness of China. That is, at the end of the day, and this goes back to Schumpeter and all the great scholars who have written about innovation, innovation requires a bottom-up. There are some simple solutions sometimes lurking around just for engineers on the ground to figure them out. But when you have a lot of imposition on the top in terms, again, of, for example, performance metrics that you need to meet, if there is a gap between what you can achieve, what you need to achieve, and what you can achieve, then just imposing requirements is not going to fix them. So China, over the past, I would say, 15 years, has tried very hard to address this problem, for example, by introducing more competition among different defense companies, clearly in aerospace, but still many agree, at least for established sectors, jet engines being an obvious case, and aerospace sector more in general. In these cases, we do know it has possibly slowed down China's accomplishment. In others, as I was pointing out, we don't know yet, right? We are at the beginning of a new possible technological revolution. So it's very hard to say what type of approach works better. In the 1930s, the Stalinist approach, with all the costs we all know, still delivered kind of impressive results. Nowadays, that approach doesn't work anymore, as the Soviet Union experience showed. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mauro. Maya, you heard like me that there is a lot about China's defense innovation efforts that are linked to actually what China gets from outside its own market, especially the technology from both Europe and the United States and other economies. So why don't you lay out to us how you see the Chinese defense innovation strategy outside China?
Sure, thanks, Fabrice. And again, just echoing the gratefulness to be on the panel with these two distinguished researchers as well. And you're right to say that China still continues to leverage foreign innovation and technology in its own military modernization and in the advancement of its own defense technological and innovation industry. So in that sense, I would say that we haven't really seen the end of that practice yet. I think in some areas, like in Europe, we're still only scratching the surface of exactly how that takes place and waking up to these practices. But I thought I'd just go through how I see these practices take place, what I think some of the challenges for them are and for us are, and also how I see them evolve. And firstly, in terms of how they take place, I think it's really important to note that although great work has been done, of course, on the illicit transfer of technology, we should recognize that there's a lot of legal means by which Chinese can acquire technology from abroad and integrate that back at home. That, of course, is important to recognize because it has a policy implication for how we address that in our own countries. Now, the acquisition of foreign tech can take place both within China as well as outside of China. Within China, we have heard reporting and seen reporting of how the requirement, for example, to create joint ventures with domestic entities takes place in China if investment by foreign companies wants to enter into certain industries and areas of innovation. That can be done directly through the creation of a subsidiary company, but it can also be done by affording Chinese investors a controlling equity stake. And I think the European Chamber of Commerce in China has done some interesting survey work on this, whereby European companies have discussed the issue of loss of IP and the increase in domestic competition as a result in China. Secondly, outside of China, technology transfer occurs through the merger and acquisition of Chinese companies with foreign firms. And this was notably the case in 2016, whereby Chinese company Midea took over KUKA. We hear this example all the time. And I think the reason that we hear about this all the time is because it raised the red flag in Europe that this practice was taking place at a greater scale that perhaps Europeans had thought before. And of course, more recently, we see that it continues to take place whereby Chinese companies have made significant investments into the UK's own semiconductor industry of late. And think here of Imagination Technologies in 2017, or just like last week, the acquisition of Newport Wafer Fab, which is the UK's largest producer of silicon chips. We can, of course, question, as Mauro said, whether this investment in civilian enterprises translates into a domestic defense-related innovation gain in China. Of course, China isn't investing in the Lockheed Martins of the world, and the Lockheed Martins of the world aren't investing in China. So there isn't that direct transfer of technology. But of course, there is an overlap whereby civilian commercial technology and defense technology are related and could be of use. And the dual use nature of technologies and subcomponents in particular in China's policy of military civil fusion create a gray area of technology acquisition that could serve both commercial and defense industries back at home in China. So whilst JVs might not provide, as Mauro said, the exact blueprint for how to engineer a total advanced aircraft engine, they could reduce the disadvantages that China's defense industry still suffers from in niche areas of technology and production. And secondly, I think it matters because Chinese industry is still reforming in certain ways, particularly in the state-owned enterprise sector, but also elsewhere, and learning how to achieve a real military-civil fusion. So in that sense, learning through joint ventures and acquisitions from foreign companies about how to make companies competitive, more efficient, I think those are real gains as well. There are, of course, ways that China is able to overcome, I think, the limitations of reverse engineering and imitation that Mauro and his brother wrote a great report on. And I just note 3 examples here. I think we should note that the space for Chinese companies to acquire foreign innovation and technology as a product is in some ways closing because of the increased awareness of these practices, and those who are skeptical of that technology transfer as a concern for Western defense industry point, I think, rightly to the strength of certain regulatory mechanisms like CFIUS in the United States. But I think it's still important to note that beyond the United States and a small number of its allies, mechanisms in other countries are still catching up to the strength of CFIUS. And even within the US's allies in NATO, for example, we see a patchwork of investment screening mechanisms in place. And in a few cases, NATO allies have no investment screening mechanism in place at all. And some also have not made any steps towards formalizing an investment screening mechanism. So in that sense, there still leaves an obvious space for technology, for Chinese companies to supplement areas of current domestic technological weakness through investment and acquisition of technology companies abroad. Now, in terms of lack of access to experienced, skilled, and nuanced talent, I think we also shouldn't underestimate the practice of leveraging foreign talent. This can take place overtly through bilateral academic collaborations or the pursuit of academic degrees in foreign universities. We've also seen reports of this taking place in a covert fashion through the use of false identities by Chinese military-linked researchers collaborating or studying abroad at Western universities on areas of technology that are seen as strategically important to defense. And I think this is an ongoing area of research in Europe, but has been a relatively recent revelation so far. And there are some investigative journalists that we can talk about, whose work we can talk about in the Q&A a little bit further in detail if that's of interest. And of course, in addition to sending Chinese researchers abroad to train in advanced technologies, there's also the leveraging of a range of talent recruitment schemes to bring foreign talent and expertise to China as well. And if you need an example of how that works, you only need to look at China's quantum satellite and the collaboration between an Austrian physicist who didn't receive funding from the European Space Agency and instead found a very willing partner in China. The issue, I think, of transfer of knowledge through academia is a tricky one for us to discuss and think about in terms of policy responses, because it really strikes at the heart and the spirit of global academic and scientific collaboration, which is undoubtedly important for innovation in the pre-competitive stage of technologies. And it touches on the greater need for supportive academia, but also the need to more clearly define what we think is strategic, not just today, but in the future. And my very last point before I close off is that we shouldn't presume that the investment in foreign innovation will always take place in the same form that it has done in the past decades. We should be looking at the horizon of Chinese investment in early stage companies and startups in areas of emerging technologies that Beijing has deemed as strategically important. These investments and acquisitions are smaller in value. They fly under the radar of some investment screening mechanisms, and they don't necessarily receive the same attention that larger investments receive. Furthermore, the practice of acqui-hire, I think, is one that we should be more cognizant of beyond commercial industries. Through this, companies are able to secure talent, engineers, and personnel through the acquisitions, as opposed to just acquiring finished products or technologies. And this might go some way to address a gap in knowledge and experience and talent that was mentioned previously. Examples of this include the acquisition by Alibaba, for example, of German startup Data Artisans, which specializes in the management of big data, and is an example of more nuanced approaches to using smaller deals to access foreign innovation. And the German example is just one of many, I'd argue, The Netherlands, for example, has an entire tech accelerator program that matches Dutch early stage tech startups with Chinese capital. And as the Counselor of Commerce of China to the Netherlands, Guo Shengzheng, stated at the 2018 conference of this tech accelerator program, this is about combining Dutch talent with Chinese manufacturing and Chinese market to promote complementary advantages. And when Alibaba was asked why they decided to acquire Data Artisans from Germany, in Germany, rather than just invest more into it, the answer was that the greater value was seen in integrating Data Artisans with Alibaba through a close collaborative relationship. And I think we're just at the cusp of understanding this practice and how it might be implemented to support defense innovation in China. And I think further research should be directed to it, but I'd be happy to discuss more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Maya. Very interesting point. Let me just, before I open the floor for our moderated discussion, let me just challenge a bit one point you made, which is, and you're right to say that both the US and especially Europe have taken some new measures over the past few years to, in a way, tighten their the access of foreign investors, foreign powers to some of their more sensitive sectors and technology. But you also concluded that we are still far from having a perfectly safe way of managing those investments that are actually could be problematic and actually could be equivalent to technological theft or forced transfer. But let me make a devil's advocate point here, is to say, actually, you could say the other way around and say, what keeps us from being at war with each other and escalating into possible conflict and tension is to keep our economies and our societies as open as possible. And I think you still hear less now, but still today, those kind of more open trade, open society voices, especially in Europe, saying there is a creeping protectionism on the argument that China is indeed doing investment practices that are problematic, to justify then us taking measures that end up being protectionist and self-defeating. How do you answer to that?
Well, I think that's a really great point. And I think I'd just push back and say that that might be very well true. But then the other answer and the other side of that coin is that we need to do more about investing in our own innovative competitiveness and our own innovative abilities. So if startups need to look abroad for VC investment, then actually, why aren't we filling that gap? If our research institutes need to look abroad for financial support, why aren't we supporting them? If we want to remain competitive and we want to continue to have this open collaboration in science and technology and in trade, that's fine. But we need to make sure that we remain competitive and we remain and retain our strengths as well.
I think it's a perfectly reasonable answer, and hopefully one that our colleagues and friends both in Brussels and European capitals can hear. Let me now open to a moderated discussion and turn to Elsa with our first question. I'm borrowing a question from the participants and I'm adding an element to it, which is, could you please tell us what you think are the critical areas where China is catching up or it's still catching up, and those critical areas where China is now on the defense innovation side, where China is leading?
Yeah, great question, and I will try to build upon some of the great points raised by my fellow panelists in discussing both the strengths and weaknesses across different domains, though this is a question that could be several hours of conversation in itself, just given the range of different technologies and applications that can come to mind here. But I think in terms of strengths or unique proficiencies of the Chinese defense industry, certainly when it comes to missiles, cruise and ballistic missiles, and the capacity to scale up production and increase precision and notionally start to integrate AI into guidance to further enhance the autonomy of some of the missiles under development, I think that's been a very strong point. And I think another feature of China's defense industry that is often pointed to as a strength, and I think this speaks to how in some cases capacity and quantity can have a quality and benefit of its own would be in shipbuilding, and the pace at which China has been expanding and upgrading its naval capabilities across the board, including the radars and sensors, have increased the quality of these ships as well, and certainly across China's defense industry, and as well as the private sector, we've also seen quite an array of different developments in drone technology. I've honestly given up on trying to keep track of just the number of different models of drones and variants. And certainly, if you look at a company on the commercial front, if you look at a company like DJI and how they really don't have any competitor that can rival them in terms of the not only the affordability but also the capability of their small scale commercial drones, which are have been useful enough that at different times the US and other Western militaries have wanted to use them for tactical operations. We've also seen them adopted by non-state actors in conflict as well. So I think that's a number of examples where commercial innovation in drone technology can provide quite useful applications, whether in logistics, reconnaissance, or some of the high-end unmanned systems, some of which may be at least to some degree autonomous in their functionality, though that is difficult to verify from looking at any given drone, is important. And let's see, I think in terms of the persistent weaknesses or the bottlenecks and choke points across the board, I think one method perhaps to look for those or to look for indicators of that is to keep an eye to the targeting in terms of tech transfer through illicit and illicit means, whether through cyber espionage or some of the acquisitions that May had mentioned in terms of where there is a sort of priority in what Chinese stakeholders are going out to try to procure or steal. That's often an indicator of weakness. And I think strength and weakness can sometimes coexist. So there's been certainly a lot of targeting of drone technology across the board, including for UUVs, but also some examples of more novel progress there. Semiconductors across the board, as has been discussed, I think is a sort of the critical weakness, as well as in some of the machines and equipment behind semiconductor manufacturing. And I think in terms of strengths as well, I guess I'd point to some of the emerging technologies where China's tried to be more of a first mover. So certainly quantum technology, not just quantum satellites, but advances in quantum computing and communications across the board. Some of the applications of artificial intelligence we've seen in whether in surveillance or starting to integrate AI into space systems or otherwise. And I'm sure I am overlooking many other possible points of strength or weakness. I will leave that to my brilliant fellow panelists to fill in where I've forgotten. But those are some of the initial thoughts that come to mind on that great question.
Let me turn now to Mauro and Maya, who might want to also answer that, but by adding one specific element, and feel free to give us a quick answer. So Elsa, what is the PLA trying to do on AI? Because clearly AI and quantum technologies are considered two of the priority areas where they really do want, probably not to be catching up, but to be leading. Well, what exactly are they trying to achieve there? And then you can give us a quick answer, Elsa, and then I turn to Mauro and Maya.
So I guess my initial response would be, what isn't the PLA trying to do with AI? There's haven't quite managed to keep count of the number of different programs and projects and initiatives across military research institutes like the Academy of Military Science and National University of Defense Technology, the defense industry like CETC or CASIC, and some of the companies that are involved in this endeavor as well. Whether Chihu 360 on AI and cyber, or Functional Laboratories and a number of drone companies, companies working on AI and wargaming and military simulations. But I guess I would, as an attempt at a very quick answer, I would say every service of the PLA is focusing on applications across every domain of warfare, whether physical or virtual. And I think a lot of what is coming into focus in the near term would be more in the category of enabling, so image detection and recognition, targeting, electronic countermeasures, situational awareness in the underwater domain, and acoustic capabilities and countermeasures. So I think there's even been sort of developments of algorithms intended to oversee operations or sort of guide and provide support to commanders for decision making in complex joint operations, such as a scenario envisioned in one competition reminiscent of the potential invasion of Taiwan. So I think one of the struggles in evaluating this is that often when we see a mention of AI being integrated into different elements of the PLA C4ISR or across or into existing weapon systems or in virtual domains like cyber warfare and electronic warfare, it is difficult to verify or to confirm or to evaluate how successful that has been. And I think this speaks to these are qualitative advancements in military capabilities. And unlike an arms race that centers on quantitative development, it's harder to count or to point to just how much of an edge this may provide, but certainly there are a lot of bets being placed. And ask me again in a couple of years how well these different initiatives have worked out. But I think certainly there's both top down and bottom up attempts to launch a lot of different applications. And I think early progress may be things like early warning, intelligence, situational awareness, information operations. I think beyond that, there'll be a lot to watch out for on these fronts going forward.
Mauro?
On the application of AI, right? So, I mean, Elsa has already touched upon like pretty much not everything, but many of the key aspects. Let me just go in depth in one of these, as I mentioned, acoustic detection. So clearly for modern weapon system, whether they are airborne system or naval system, submarine systems, a key feature, a key advantage for two sides is being able to detect, identify, track, and eventually engage an enemy. And in submarine, so this is even more important because the submarines for nuclear deterrence take advantage of the ocean to hide from enemy sensors. So application of advanced computer systems, machine learning, that is like part of the AI revolution, this essentially lowers the threshold through which we can detect an enemy submarines. That is, those who are familiar with statistics, it lowers the standard errors. And so it allows us to much more accurately distinguish a real submarine from possible false positives. So, and this speaks loud about how important this sector is. That is, some people, for example, over the past few years have spoken about the arrival of so-called ocean transparency. That is because of multi-sector connectivity, much more powerful sector, as well as the growth in data, available acoustic data, as well as much more capable processor and signal processing software. We will be able, or the world is going to transition to a stage in which detection is going to become much, much easier. Who leads in this process is going to have a key advantage. So this, to me, just to simplify the issue, is a key way to understand why not just the PLA, but of course, Western countries as well, have been paying so much attention to artificial intelligence and new kind of disruptive technologies.
Thanks, Mauro. Mia, and I also understand you want to follow up on the last question and the last topic we covered on our economic response to China. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to touch on both of your questions. So firstly, just to add on to the really great responses already from Elsa and Mauro, I'd say that when we think of China and AI, we immediately go to killer drone scenarios and thoughts and images, whereby China leads so far ahead of AI because they have this authoritarian system in place. They're able to collect and manage data without any regulatory constrictions that we might face in the West. And I think that's something that we still need to have a more nuanced debate about rather than just assume blindly. And I think in terms of what they're looking to apply AI to, I think we should focus on some real basic problems that the PLA will face in its modernization reforms and attempts. And these are, how do you train a military that hasn't fought an active war since a skirmish with Vietnam in 1979? And that points to exactly what Elsa was saying about using the virtual realm to train and have simulations and exercises. And secondly, of course, in terms of addressing a second real basic problem, how do you mobilize and provide logistics, not just in peacetime, but also in wartime, of a military the size of 1.03 million active personnel across a geographic expanse the size of China? I mean, in that sense, AI, I think, will also be sought to solve some basic problems. Now, in terms of your previous question, I've been thinking about this whilst we've talked about the other questions and listening at the same time, of course, and I want to make one thing really clear to actors in Europe. And that is that whilst maintaining open trade relationships, of course, is a positive and might prevent more conflict, and complete bifurcation might not be possible, but also not conducive to future positive ties and innovation. I also think that we need to be very aware of the real changes on the ground and on the water that technology transfer to China and the PLA in particular can have for actors, partners, and allies in the region. So even if it doesn't affect us immediately today in Europe, technology transfer to, for example, Sansha City in the areas of improving maritime domain awareness capabilities, maritime communication infrastructure, and also maritime monitoring capabilities has a real impact on how maritime militia, the Chinese Coast Guard, and the PLAN project their power across the South China Sea in a way that regional and littoral states and claimant states in the South China Sea might not be able to match. So whereas it might not have a direct impact on us today, it does in other parts of the world and our friends and allies, and we need to be aware of that and sensitive to that.
I tend to agree with you, Maya, having personally advocated for a CFIUS type mechanism in Europe, which is not there yet, but at least we made more progress over the last few years with the EU FDI screening mechanism. I tend to agree with you that we're still not there. If I look, for example, at the simple fact that there is no central registry and assessment of what kind of investments are happening in Europe in sensitive sectors or sensitive technology. So if you reach out to anyone in the EU institutions, you will have only a very patchy picture of that. So I think we are not even there yet in having the first primary response right, which is our assessment. And for assessment, we need first to be able to connect the dots together. Let me maybe actually ask the final question, and here I borrow again a question from our participants, and I will ask our guest speakers to keep it to 1 minute in order to conclude on time. And it's a question related to the recent cyber power assessment that was released by the Institute a week ago, and which reached some very interesting conclusions, starting with the fact that the US is considered as the only top tier cyber power, whilst China is still considered as a second tier, which is getting into the top tier provided it meets some important criteria. And my question here to the three of you, starting with Elsa, is what kind of bet could you make where China will be on the defense innovation side in 10 years? And I know it's a very broad question, but I think it's interesting for our participants to better understand where you think China is likely to be in 10 years' time. Because if you look at the trajectory of the last 10 years, we're seeing a very steep growth, both quantitatively but also qualitatively. So what's your one area or almost one line prediction for the next 10 years? Thank you.
That's I try to avoid predicting the future as best I can, because I think there is so much uncertainty and inescapably so in talking about new and emerging technologies, especially given all of the hype and certainly sort of no shortage of propaganda in terms of how PRC state media sometimes breathlessly characterizes the latest advances, given the prestige and sort of importance of innovation to China's national rejuvenation. So yeah, I guess perhaps the safest prediction would be that I think we can expect that China 10 years from now will have achieved, I think, significant advancement on many of the fronts where we see resources being directed today, given the funding and funding of projects and cultivation of talent that is occurring across some of the national mega projects, along with other priority initiatives, whether that is artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum technology, next generation telecommunications. I think there's certainly reasons to expect sort of where there are strengths emerging for those to sort of continue. And I think we also should be prepared for the possibility of surprise, especially where there may be intersections among technology. So a lot of interest, for instance, in China in quantum machine learning or quantum artificial intelligence, and I think that is quite nascent, but is fascinating and will be worth watching. But I also suspect we won't see China have completely resolved some of the current weaknesses, including in chips, as we've discussed, the struggles with semiconductors. I think we'll see perhaps some, 10 years from now, perhaps a unevenness as there is today, where there's a juxtaposition of strength and weakness and of more genuinely original innovation with a continued reliance upon global resources, whether illicitly or illicitly acquired. So we may be surprised in some respects, but I think we can expect that China's strength and power will still be a subject of debate, and how we see progress or weakness depends on which sector or which particular domain we consider.
Thank you, Elsa. Mauro, final word, final answer.
Yeah, I'm going to echo Elsa. I'm not going to make any prediction. I'm just going to say China has made impressive accomplishments, but the last 10% of cutting edge, high performing technologies, this is the most difficult part. And the key question is going to be whether in many of these sectors, like chips, aero engines, you name it, converters, for example, whether China is going to address the key problems that I've discussed earlier, both internally as well as depending on the technology. So if China will be able to address these challenges, and I'm sure in some realm it will, and the technology is not going to advance at an exponential rate, then for sure China is going to catch up and possibly even lead in some of these sectors. If it will not, and in the meantime, technology will keep advancing at a very, very, very fast pace, in 10 years, we will still see that China is struggling in some realms.
Thank you. Maya, final answer?
Final answer, I think, is just to reflect perhaps on the strength of the DTIB in the past few years and point to the rankings of Chinese SOEs that are related to defense production in Defense News' Top 100, for which I provide the numbers each year. That list is coming out on the 12th of July, so keep an eye out for it. And I think in general, just the upward trend of these companies will continue, despite, of course, that last 10% that Mauro and Elsa have also talked about. But just to take a look at this year's numbers, I think it's a clear indication of how the size and the relative protection of some of these industries allow the Chinese to deal with crises in ways that we perhaps aren't in the same position to do. So whilst they have weaknesses and undoubtedly will continue to have weaknesses, they also have strengths that we shouldn't underestimate.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the three of you for what has been a great conversation with very impressive insights. I also would like to thank our participants for joining us. And you can all watch again the conversation, which was very rich and dense. So you might want to watch the recording, which will be posted online in the next few days. And again, thank you very much to Elsa, Mauro, and Maya for your insights, your time, and for the fourth Defense Innovation Talks. Many thanks indeed.